In this video, we're going to talk about stacks and stack sets. So in the previous videos, we learned that we can use Cloudformation to instantiate resources using infrastructure as code. When we create a stack set, we're creating a stack of resources based on a Cloudformation template. In this example, we're going to use the template that we talked about in the previous video. And we'll get started by making sure we're in the Cloudformation dashboard and clicking Create Stack. Now, you'll notice for the selected template page, you have a few different options. There is a visual designer that you can use to drag and drop different resources and connect them. Now, that being said, while the visual designer is a really cool tool, I prefer more granular control over my templates, so I like to use just regular templates. So back to Create Stack. Our other options are to select a sample template if we want, or to either upload a template from our local computer, or to specify an Amazon S3 template URL. And that's the option that we're going to take here. This is the URL of the template that we talked about in the previous video. So, with our template chosen, let's click Next. Now, for any stack that you try to instantiate, it's always going to ask you for a stack name. And then for the other input, you'll notice we have 3 parameters and they look familiar. And that's because they're the parameters that we talked about in a previous video. We have key name, instance type, and SSH location. You'll notice the instance type starts with a default and gives us a list of different instance types. Let's check out what that looks like in the template. So for instance type, we see that we have a default, and then we see that we have allowed values. And anytime you give a parameter an allowed values field, then you're going to get a drop down of those allowed values when you try to create the stack. For key name, it looks like it's giving us a couple of different options here, so let's see what that looks like in the template. We have key name, and then we have the type of AWS EC2 key pair key name. So what this parameter is doing for us is it's grabbing any key pair that we have in the region that we're trying to deploy it in. So because I have 2 key pairs in the North Virginia region, I'm seeing both key pairs here. For SSH location, it's giving us a default setter range, just like we expect it to. You'll notice it's also only allowing a certain regex pattern, so we have to make sure that we match a valid CIDR IP range. Let's leave it on this IP range for now, because I'm not going to be SSHing into this instance. And we'll hit Next. Now you have the option to apply tags, which will apply to any resource that's spun up in this stack. For example, if I wanted a certain department to pay for this stack, then I could attach a billing group key and a value of their billing ID. That tag would then get distributed to every resource that gets created in this stack. Optionally, you also have the option to use a specific IAM role. And if you choose an IAM role here, then Cloudformation will use that role to create, modify, or delete any resources in this stack. If you don't choose a role, then Cloudformation will use the permissions that are defined in your specific account. Rollback triggers allow you to have AWS Cloudformation monitor the state of your application during stack creation and updating, and to roll the operation back if that application breaches the threshold of any of the alarms that you've specified. Specifically here we have monitoring time, which is the amount of time that Cloudformation should monitor all rollback triggers after the stack creation or update operation deploys all necessary resources. And here we'll see we have the ability to set a CloudWatch alarm. We're not going to do that just yet. We'll talk about CloudWatch in another video. And then, under Advanced Settings, we have a couple of options here as well. If you want to be notified of any changes in the stack, then you can specify an SNS topic. And SNS is something we'll go over in a future video, so we're not going to worry about this for now. Finally, similarly to how EC2 offers termination protection, you can enable termination protection on your Cloudformation stack as well. Finally, if you prefer, you can give your stack a timeout, which is the number of minutes before your stack creation will time out, so that if something goes wrong, it's not just hung up in the status pending. And then rollback on failure means if for any reason your stack fails to deploy, would you like it to roll back? The default is yes, meaning if anything fails, then any resource that was fully or partially created in that stack is going to roll back. With that being said, Let's continue. Next page is just a summary page, so we'll hit create. And this is going to take just a moment, so I'm going to place this video on a brief pause. And there you go, we have a completed stack. Now, a few things I want to pay attention to are the events here. So this is something you can monitor while the stack is being created. And in fact, you'll see that we have a few create in progress tags here. And you'll be able to see when every different resource was created. You'll also be able to see any rollback triggers that we set, and of course we didn't set any. And then the resources that it deployed. So it looks like we have two, our EC2 instance and the EC2 security group, and that's exactly what we expected. And finally, we have our outputs, and recall that our template gave us 4 outputs: instance ID, availability zone, public DNS, and public IP, and those are the 4 we see here. Now recall that the availability zone used the sudo function getAttribute to get the availability zone of the EC2 instance, and that's exactly what has happened here. Now, just to confirm that we see what we expect, let's go to EC2. And there we go. There's the instance that we created, and we know that that's the correct instance because the public IP matches. Now that we have a successfully created stack, we can do a few things to that stack. If we set termination protection to either enabled or disabled, we can change that here. And of course, we left it disabled earlier, so if we wanted to enable that now, we could. And now, just like with EC2 instances, if we tried to delete the stack, it's going to tell us that we can't because we have termination protection enabled. Similarly, if we need to update anything about the stack, then we can go to Update Stack, and it's going to look very similar to the stack creation process. If we want, we can leave the current template, which means the template that we used earlier, or we can specify a different one. If we leave it with the current template, then it'll give us the option to update any of the parameters that we set previously. Now, the only thing we can't change is the stack name, but once again, we could change any of our parameters if we want, and then redeploy the same stack. And the last thing I want to talk about in this video are Cloudformation stack sets. And stack sets are a way for Cloudformation to deploy a stack across multiple AWS accounts. Let's say that we have another account hosting an application, and we want to deploy an EC2 instance uniformly into that account. We could do that with stack sets. Of course, just like stacks, you have the ability to use a sample template, upload one directly, or specify an Amazon S3 template URL. Let's grab the URL that we used earlier and see what that looks like. Now, of course, we see the same here. And this is where things get just a little bit different. The first thing you'll notice is that you can deploy stacks into different accounts. And to deploy stacks in accounts, you can either have multiple accounts in this field, or you can upload a CSV of valid accounts. Another option is deploying stacks into AWS organizational units, and organizational units are beyond the scope of this course, but just so you know, they're ways to organize multiple accounts within an AWS organization. So if you had an organizational unit for, say, production application accounts, and you had 3 accounts in there, then you could choose your organizational unit here, and the stack set would deploy your stack into each of those 3 production accounts. The next thing you do is decide which regions you wanted to deploy your stacks into, set the maximum concurrent accounts that you can deploy into at one time, and then set your failure tolerance, which is the amount of accounts that can fail on stack creation before you stop trying the operation. Now, we're not going to deploy a stack set, but I do want to talk about one more thing in your stack set creation process, and that's the IAM admin role and the IAM execution role. So you need 2 roles in order to be able to deploy a stack set. You need a role in the account that you want to deploy the set from, and a role in the account that you want to deploy the set to. The account that you deploy the set from has to have permissions to deploy resources in the child account. And the child account has to have a role that allows external access from your parent account. And that'll wrap it up for our video on stacks and stack sets. So if all of that makes sense, then feel free to move on.